The wind howled through the mountain canyons, carrying heavy snow and thick, swirling clouds that made it almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The lonely cowboy trudged forward, boots sinking into the fresh snow with every step. His coat was thick and worn, and his hat was pulled low to shield his face from the biting wind. He had spent many winters in these mountains, but this storm was harsher than any he had faced. The snow fell in heavy sheets covering the trees, rocks, and trails, and the cold cut through his gloves and coat like tiny knives. He had been checking on his herd, ensuring that the cattle were safe in the small pens he had built near the edge of the canyon, but now the storm was making the return journey treacherous. Every step was slow, careful, and exhausting. As he rounded a bend in the path, he thought he saw a movement in the distance, a shadow barely visible through the heavy snow. He squinted, trying to make out what it was. At first, he assumed it might be an animal, a deer or a lost coyote perhaps, but as he got closer, he realized it was a person. A woman, hunched over and shivering violently, was struggling against the storm. Her thin clothing offered little protection and her boots were soaked through. Her hands and face were red from the cold, and she appeared almost too weak to walk. The cowboy's heart went out to her immediately. He knew the dangers of exposure in these mountains. One night in this storm could be deadly. "Hey," he called, his voice loud but careful, trying not to startle her. "Come here. You can't stay out here." The woman paused, her eyes wide and frozen from the cold. She tried to move toward him but stumbled and almost fell. Without thinking, the cowboy rushed forward, reaching out his arm and helping her steady herself. "You're lucky I found you," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "We need to get out of this wind before it takes hold of you." She nodded weakly, barely able to speak. Her teeth chattered and she looked up at him with eyes full of fear and exhaustion. He noticed a small necklace around her neck, simple but beautifully crafted with designs he recognized from the Apache people he had read about in stories. It was subtle, but it hinted at her heritage, though he did not yet understand who she truly was. The snow was deep, and the wind tore at their faces as they began the slow trek toward his cabin, which lay several miles down the trail. He supported her as best as he could, sometimes lifting her over snowdrifts that were higher than his knees. They moved in silence at first, each step a struggle. The woman's breathing was shallow, and her fingers were so stiff that she could barely hold on to his arm. The cowboy tried to speak to keep her calm. "You're going to make it," he said firmly. "Just a little farther. My cabin's not far from here. We'll get you warm, and then you can rest." She nodded again, grateful for his strength and guidance. She explained that she had been separated from her group while traveling through the mountains, trying to reach a safer area before the storm struck. She had been walking for hours, and the cold had begun to overwhelm her. Every step she took was a battle, and she feared that if she could not reach shelter soon, she might not survive the night. The cowboy felt a deep sense of responsibility. He had seen snowstorms take lives before, and he knew that even the strongest person could succumb to exposure if they were not careful. He pushed his own fatigue aside and focused entirely on helping her. He encouraged her to keep moving, speaking in a low, steady voice that seemed to cut through the howling wind. After what felt like hours, they finally saw the faint outline of his cabin through the snow, a small wooden structure built for shelter during harsh winters. Relief washed over both of them. The cowboy guided her inside, shutting the door against the wind and snow, and immediately set to work lighting a fire. He placed a pile of dry wood on the hearth, striking a match and coaxing a flame to life. Soon the fire crackled warmly, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. The woman sank onto a bench near the fire, wrapping her arms around herself. She was still shivering violently, and the cowboy quickly fetched blankets from a chest, layering them over her soaked clothing. He offered her a small cup of warm broth, which she accepted eagerly, sipping it carefully. The warmth began to bring color back to her face, and her hands slowly lost some of their icy stiffness. Finally, she looked up at him, eyes wide and serious. I can't survive the night without warmth," she said, her voice trembling. "There's only one way. Share my bed or freeze." The cowboy froze, momentarily taken aback by the bluntness of her statement. He had not expected such a direct demand, but he quickly understood the gravity of the situation. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and there was no one else around. Survival had to come first. "All right," he said, keeping his voice calm. "We'll do it. We need to stay warm, that's all that matters." She nodded, relief flooding her face. They carefully settled into the bed, both wrapped in blankets. The room was quiet except for the crackling fire, and the cowboy could feel her trembling begin to ease as the warmth seeped into her body. At first, there was an awkward tension between them, the kind that comes from sharing such a vulnerable moment with a stranger. But gradually, the atmosphere softened. They began to talk, their voices low so as not to disturb the fragile peace of the cabin. She shared stories of her Apache tribe, speaking of the mountains and rivers she knew from childhood, of her family, and the traditions she held dear. She spoke of her journey, the dangers she had faced, and how she had ended up alone in the storm. The cowboy listened intently, fascinated by her courage and resilience. He shared some of his own experiences, talking about the mountains, the herd, and the life he had built in solitude. He spoke of long winters, lonely nights, and the challenges of living in such a remote area. Through their conversation, a sense of trust began to grow, a fragile but growing connection between two very different lives brought together by chance and necessity. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, they found a small measure of comfort. They stayed awake for long hours, sharing stories, laughter, and moments of silence that spoke more than words could. The cowboy realized that despite the harsh conditions, this night was unlike any other he had ever experienced. As the night wore on, he thought about the woman beside him. She was brave, practical, and surprisingly strong, even in her weakened state. She had faced the storm head-on, and yet she trusted him enough to rely on him completely. In turn, he felt a sense of purpose, knowing that his actions had directly saved her life. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the small windows, the wind had begun to soften, and the snow fell more lightly. They were both exhausted, but they had survived the night. The cowboy looked at her, feeling a mix of relief, admiration, and quiet respect. This encounter would stay with him for a long time, a reminder of the unexpected bonds that could form in moments of crisis. He knew that the storm was only part of the challenge. There were still many dangers ahead, and their journey was far from over. But for now they had found warmth, safety, and a fragile connection that neither of them had anticipated. The night had tested their courage, their judgment, and their willingness to trust a stranger, and as the fire continued to crackle and the snow fell gently outside, the cowboy realized that this night was the beginning of something more, a story of survival, trust, and the unlikeliest of friendships forged in the heart of a snowbound wilderness. The first light of dawn filtered softly through the cabin windows, casting a pale glow on the snow-covered ground outside. The wind had eased, leaving the mountains calm, but the aftermath of the storm still showed in drifts of snow piled high against the trees and rocks. The cowboy stirred slowly, feeling the ache in his muscles from the long night of helping the woman. He glanced at her, still wrapped in blankets, sitting on the edge of the bed, her face showing the soft glow of recovery. She looked up at him and gave a small, sincere smile, one that spoke more than words. Over a simple breakfast of warmed bread and hot broth, they began to talk again. The cowboy was careful, still unsure how much he should ask. But the woman spoke freely, and with every sentence the cowboy felt the weight of the story she carried. She explained that she was the daughter of a respected Apache chief. Her journey into the mountains had been dangerous but necessary. She was delivering a critical message to a distant part of her tribe, a task that required stealth and courage. The storm had been unexpected, separating her from the people traveling with her. She had wandered alone for hours, every step threatening her survival, until he had found her. The cowboy listened in awe, the magnitude of her situation slowly sinking in. He had thought she was simply a lost traveler, but she was more than that. She was someone with responsibilities, courage, and a heritage that commanded respect. He felt humbled by her presence and grateful that he had been able to help. After breakfast, they prepared to leave the cabin. The snow had begun to melt slightly, but the trails were still dangerous, with ice hidden beneath fresh snow and fallen trees blocking paths. They decided to travel together until she reached a safer area. Each step was slow and careful, but their movements were more confident than the previous night. The cowboy helped her navigate the icy slopes, lifting her over snowdrifts and clearing paths where branches had fallen. The hardships of the journey drew them closer, as each had to rely on the other's strength, judgment, and trust. As they walked, the woman began to share more about her life. She spoke of her tribe's traditions, of the elders who guided them, and of the lessons she had learned growing up among her people. She described the values of courage, honor, and loyalty, and how those values had shaped her decisions. The cowboy, in turn, shared stories of his own life. He told her about the loneliness of working the mountains alone, about the quiet satisfaction of tending to his herd, and the struggles of living in a remote place where help was rare and life was often harsh. They discovered a mutual respect for each other's strength, adaptability, and determination to survive. The day wore on, and they encountered challenges along the way. At one point, the woman slipped on a hidden patch of ice, nearly falling down a small slope. The cowboy grabbed her just in time, steadying her and holding her close until she regained her balance. The scare left them both laughing nervously, the tension of the past hours melting slightly in the warmth of shared relief. Moments like this created a bond between them, a connection forged not through choice but through circumstance and survival. By mid-afternoon, they found a small, sheltered clearing that offered a chance to rest and regain energy. The cowboy started a small fire, careful not to draw attention from any wild animals while the woman unpacked her few supplies. They ate a modest meal, sharing bread and dried meat, speaking quietly about the events that had brought them together. She expressed her deep gratitude, her words simple but sincere. "You saved my life," she said. "I would not have lasted the night without you." The cowboy shook his head, modesty mixing with pride. "I did what anyone would do," he said. "I couldn't leave you out there. No one should have to face the storm alone." The woman's expression softened, her eyes reflecting the respect and admiration she felt for him. She spoke of the strength and honor she saw in his actions, noting that courage was not only about facing danger but also about choosing to help others, even when it meant risking oneself. The cowboy felt a warmth in her words, one that had little to do with the fire or blankets, and more to do with the acknowledgement of his integrity and humanity. As they continued their journey, she confided in him the reason for her secrecy. Her trip into the mountains had been kept hidden from many in her tribe because of political tensions. If certain factions knew where she was or why she was traveling, it could have caused serious problems for her family and the community she represented. Her voice carried a mix of fear and determination, as she explained that her journey was critical, not only for her safety, but for the well-being of her people. The cowboy was struck by her bravery, the quiet strength she carried even in the face of danger. Throughout the day, they faced more obstacles. Fallen trees blocked their path, icy streams had to be crossed carefully, and steep ridges required careful navigation. At each challenge, they relied on each other. The cowboy's experience in the mountains complemented her knowledge of the terrain, and together they moved steadily forward. With every obstacle overcome, their mutual trust deepened. By late afternoon, the woman grew tired. The cowboy noticed her exhaustion and insisted on taking a break. She allowed herself to rest, leaning against him as he supported her. She reflected on how unlikely this meeting had been, how a chance encounter in a snowstorm had brought them together. She spoke of the lessons she had learned about trust, resilience, and the kindness of strangers. The cowboy listened quietly, humbled by her words, realizing that he had also learned from her about courage, dignity, and the strength that comes from surviving against all odds. Eventually, they reached the edge of the canyon where her journey would continue. She turned to him, her expression a mix of gratitude and solemn respect. She handed him a small token, a handcrafted symbol from her tribe. She explained that it represented protection, honor, and respect, and that it was a gesture to show her appreciation for his courage and kindness. The cowboy accepted it with humility, feeling the weight of its significance. Before parting, she made a promise. Though their paths might diverge, she hoped that they would meet again under safer circumstances. The cowboy watched as she disappeared down the snow-covered trail, her figure gradually blending with the whiteness of the mountains. He felt a mix of relief, admiration, and the quiet impact of a night and day that had tested both courage and compassion. As he turned back toward his cabin, he reflected on the extraordinary events of the past 24 hours. He realized that some encounters in life were rare and unforgettable. The woman had shown him bravery in its purest form, and he had provided the help she needed to survive. Their bond, formed in the harshness of the storm and the challenges of the mountain, was a reminder that humanity often shines brightest in moments of vulnerability. He returned to his cabin as the sun began to set, casting golden light over the snow. The mountains were quiet now, peaceful after the storm. He placed the token she had given him on the mantel, a small but powerful reminder of the woman's courage and the night that had changed him. He thought about how life was unpredictable, how the cold and danger of a single night could bring people together in ways that neither could have imagined. The cowboy understood that their meeting was more than survival. It was a lesson in trust, compassion, and the unexpected connections that can shape a life. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that helping someone in need was a choice that could have far-reaching consequences, not only for the one being helped, but also for the one offering aid. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the sky, the cowboy sat quietly by the fire, reflecting on the lessons of the past day. He thought about the woman's strength, the courage it took to face the storm alone, and the wisdom she carried from her tribe. He felt a quiet pride in having played a part in her survival, and a deep respect for the trust she had placed in him. Though they had gone through danger, cold and uncertainty together, the cowboy knew that this encounter would stay with him forever. The memory of the snowbound night, the firelit cabin, and the woman who had demanded with courage and practicality that they share warmth or face the cold would never fade. It was a story of survival, respect, and the extraordinary power of human connection, forged in the heart of a harsh winter in the wild mountains.